From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes.
November 22nd, 1963. Dallas, Texas. A city dressed in anticipation. Its streets lined with thousands of Americans eager to catch a glimpse of their young, charismatic president. The motorcade rolls through Dealey Plaza, and in a matter of seconds, the trajectory of American history is shattered by the crack of gunfire. Within hours, Lee Harvey Oswald is named the lone shooter. Within days, he is dead. And within years, the questions begin to pile up. Questions that no official report, no government commission, and no courtroom has ever fully silenced. For over 6 decades, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy has remained the most scrutinized, debated, and contested murder in American history. Thousands of documents have been released. Hundreds of witnesses have spoken. Dozens of investigators have dedicated their careers to pulling back the curtain. And yet, the complete truth, the kind that shuts the door on all doubt, has never arrived. Until now, something extraordinary may be changing that. Buried in the archives, largely overlooked beside the more famous Zapruder film, sits a piece of 8mm home movie footage that researchers believe could hold the answer to the question that has haunted a nation for generations. This is not a government tape. It was not shot by a professional. It was filmed by an ordinary man standing on a sidewalk in Dallas, holding a modest home camera, simply wanting to capture the president passing by. His name was Orville Nix. And what his camera recorded that afternoon may be the closest thing we have ever had to footage of the actual shooter. To understand why the Nix film matters so deeply, you first have to understand what makes it fundamentally different from every other piece of footage taken that day. Most people are familiar with the Zapruder film, the 26-second home movie shot by Abraham Zapruder that captured the fatal moment in heartbreaking detail. That film became the centerpiece of the Warren Commission, was analyzed frame by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and has been studied by researchers and historians for more than half a century. It shows the limousine. It shows the president. It shows the moment of impact. But here is what the Zapruder film does not show: the grassy knoll. The grassy knoll, that embankment to the right of the motorcade's path, lined with a wooden fence and shadowed by trees, has been at the center of virtually every serious alternative theory about the assassination. Dozens of eyewitnesses standing in Dealey Plaza that day reported hearing shots from that direction. Some said they smelled gunpowder near the fence. Others claimed they saw a figure crouching behind it. The Warren Commission dismissed these accounts and concluded that all shots came from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. But the whispers never stopped. Orville Nix was standing on the south side of Dealey Plaza when he pressed record. His position was not the same as Zapruder's. His camera did not follow the limousine in tight frame. Instead, it captured the motorcade while keeping the grassy knoll firmly in the background, visible, persistent, and central. While everyone else was watching the president, the Nix film was watching the knoll. That one difference is why this footage has become the most important unresolved piece of visual evidence in the entire Kennedy assassination investigation. Because if there was a second shooter hiding behind that fence, there is only one camera that was pointed directly at them. And that camera belonged to Orville Nix. Orville Nix was not a man chasing history. He was an engineer from Dallas, an everyday American who happened to bring his Keystone AutoZoom 8mm camera to work that Friday morning because the President of the United States was coming to town. He joined the crowds gathering along the motorcade route, found a spot near the corner of Main Street and Houston Street, and waited. When the motorcade turned onto Elm Street, Nix raised his camera and began filming. He was not thinking about angles or lighting or historical significance. He was doing what millions of Americans would have done in that moment, trying to preserve a memory. What he captured instead was a document of catastrophe. His footage runs for just over a minute. Within its frames, you can see the presidential limousine moving through the plaza. You can see the moment the shots are fired. You can see Jackie Kennedy climbing onto the back of the car. You can see Secret Service Agent Clint Hill sprinting toward the vehicle. and in the background, persistent, partially obscured, but undeniably present, you can see the grassy knoll. Nix himself, in interviews conducted after the assassination, stated plainly that he believed the shots had come from behind the fence, not from the book depository. He pointed to the area between the depository and the nearby railroad tracks as the origin of the gunfire. He said so not as a conspiracy theorist, not as someone with an agenda, but as a man who had been standing there, who had heard it, who had seen it. He eventually accepted the official version of events, as most Americans did in the years following the Warren Commission report. But his original impression, formed in the raw, unfiltered seconds after the shooting, has never been fully explained away. And the footage his camera captured continues to carry the weight of that unresolved moment. For decades, the Nix film was considered too dark, too grainy, and too technically flawed to yield meaningful conclusions. Nix had made a critical error in his film choice. He loaded his camera with Type A film stock, a variety designed for indoor lighting conditions, and used it in the bright midday sun of a Dallas afternoon without the proper filters. The result was footage significantly darker than other films taken that day, with heavy grain, reduced contrast, and murky shadows filling the background. This technical limitation became both its greatest weakness and, paradoxically, its greatest source of intrigue. Because in those murky shadows, in the dark background near the fence line, researchers have repeatedly claimed to see something. A shape, a figure, movement that should not be there. Over the years, multiple independent analysts have studied the footage and pointed to what they describe as a human form visible near the wooden fence at the top of the grassy knoll, present in the frames captured during the shooting sequence, and then absent afterward. Some claim the shape appears consistent with a person crouching, then moving. Others argue it is nothing more than a shadow, a trick of light on degraded film. The problem is that without the original reel, nobody can say with certainty who is right. When Nix submitted his film to federal authorities in December 1963, a process began that would become one of the most troubling chapters in the entire assassination evidence saga. The original 8mm reel disappeared. Nix himself reported that when the film was returned to him days later, frames were missing. The total frame count did not match what he had originally shot. Whether this was the result of processing errors, careless handling, or something more deliberate has never been established. But the fact remains, the original, unaltered film has never been publicly accounted for. What exists today are copies, duplicates of duplicates, each generation slightly further from the clarity of the original. And in the world of photographic forensics, that distance matters enormously. Every time film is reproduced, detail is lost. Every time an image is duplicated, the grain increases, and the fine details that might reveal or disprove the presence of a figure behind a fence become harder to distinguish from noise. The full truth of what the Nix film captured that afternoon may be sitting in those lost frames, the ones that Nix said were missing when he got his footage back. And the question of where those frames went and why they disappeared is a question that has never received a satisfying answer. The original Nix film reel has had one of the most complicated and troubling chains of custody in the history of documentary evidence. After its initial submission to federal authorities, it passed through multiple hands: the FBI, news organizations, commercial licensors, and government archives, before eventually disappearing from the record entirely. United Press International acquired the copyright to the footage for $5,000, transforming a private citizen's home movie into a commercial media asset. It was licensed, distributed, and broadcast across news networks and documentary programs for years. Each broadcast made the footage more familiar to the public, while making the original reel harder to trace. By the time investigators conducting the House Select Committee on Assassination's examination in the late 1970s sought to analyze the film, the original 8mm reel was gone. UPI returned the copyright to the Nix family in 1992, along with whatever copies remained, but the original negative, the source material from which everything else was derived, was never located. The Nix family eventually transferred the copyright to the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, the institution dedicated to preserving the history of the assassination. But the original reel remained missing. And missing, in this context, does not simply mean misplaced. Missing means unaccounted for. Missing means that the single best source of visual evidence about what happened near the grassy knoll on November 22, 1963, has been out of public hands for decades with no clear explanation. This is the heart of a federal lawsuit now being pursued by Orville Nix's granddaughter, Linda Gale Nix Jackson. In January 2026, a federal judge allowed the lawsuit to proceed, marking a significant legal milestone in what has become a deeply personal fight for accountability. The family central argument invokes the Fifth Amendment, the claim that the government effectively seized their property without just compensation. But the lawsuit goes beyond a property dispute. It is, at its core, an argument that the American public has been denied access to evidence that could materially change our understanding of one of the most important events in modern history. The legal case raises profound questions that extend far beyond the Nix family or the Kennedy assassination. What responsibility does the government have to preserve and provide access to historically significant evidence? What recourse exists when that evidence disappears under government custody? And perhaps most unsettling, what does it mean when the original version of a key piece of evidence goes missing and no one is ever held responsible for explaining how? The reason the legal battle over the original Nix reel has taken on new urgency is not simply historical sentiment. It is because the tools now available to analyze that footage simply did not exist when the film first disappeared from the record. In recent years, advances in high-resolution digital scanning, AI-assisted image enhancement, and forensic photographic analysis have transformed what is possible when examining old film footage. Techniques that were science fiction in the 1970s are now standard practice in forensic labs. Artificial intelligence algorithms can now reduce noise, stabilize shaky frames, reconstruct damaged or degraded sections of film, and enhance detail from footage that previously appeared beyond recovery. The same technology that has been used to restore century-old silent films and analyze war zone surveillance footage can, in theory, be applied to the Nix film. What this means in practical terms is significant. Analysts working with the original 8mm negative, not a copy, not a duplicate, but the actual source material, could potentially clarify the shapes visible near the fence line on the grassy knoll with a level of detail never before achievable. They could determine whether the figure that researchers have debated for decades is a person, a shadow, a post, or simply an artifact of the film's degradation. They could examine the missing frames, if they were indeed removed rather than accidentally lost, and establish whether they showed anything that might explain their disappearance. More importantly, they could do so transparently and scientifically, with peer-reviewed methodology that would allow independent experts to verify or challenge the conclusions. The family's attorneys argue precisely this point. The original reel is not a collector's item. It is not a souvenir. It is a scientific resource, one that could yield answers that every other analysis has failed to produce because every other analysis has been working from inferior copies. The difference between analyzing a third-generation duplicate and analyzing the original negative is, in photographic terms, the difference between reading a faxed photocopy of a document and reading the document itself. There is no guarantee, of course, that enhanced analysis of the original Nix film would produce definitive answers. The footage may be too damaged. The original reel may have deteriorated beyond recovery. The figure near the fence may ultimately prove to be nothing more than a shadow. But the possibility, and the fact that we have never had the chance to truly find out, is precisely why the fight to recover the original matters so much. It is tempting, 60-plus years after the assassination, to ask whether any of this still matters. John F. Kennedy is gone. The Cold War is over. The political landscape of 1963 bears little resemblance to the world we live in today. So why does the question of exactly who fired those shots in Dallas continue to command so much attention, generate so much emotion, and drive people like Linda Gale Nix Jackson to spend years of their lives in federal court? The answer has nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with trust. The Kennedy assassination was not simply a crime. It was a rupture, a moment that fundamentally altered the relationship between the American government and the American public. Polls conducted over the decades have consistently shown that a majority of Americans do not fully believe the official conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. That persistent skepticism is not born from irrationality or paranoia. It is born from the documented fact that evidence has gone missing, that official narratives have shifted, that key witnesses died under unusual circumstances, and that documents related to the assassination were classified and kept from the public for decades after the event. The Nix film is a symbol of all of that, a piece of evidence that passed through government hands and came back with missing frames, an original reel that disappeared without explanation, a family that has spent decades trying to get answers and been met with bureaucratic silence. When a federal judge allows that lawsuit to proceed, it is not a small thing. It is the legal system acknowledging that these questions deserve answers, that the American public has a legitimate interest in understanding what really happened in Dealey Plaza, that evidence does not belong to government agencies, it belongs to history. And if the original Nix reel is ever found, if it is scanned, enhanced, and properly analyzed using the technology now available, the results could be genuinely transformative. Not because we are certain it shows a second shooter, but because we have never truly been able to say with confidence what it does or does not show. The shadows near that fence have never been properly illuminated. The missing frames have never been accounted for. The question has never been fully asked in the language of modern forensic science. Orville Nix was an ordinary man with a modest camera who stood on a sidewalk and pressed record. He had no idea that his home movie would become evidence in a federal lawsuit more than 60 years later. He had no way of knowing that the footage he shot would still be generating headlines in the 21st century, still provoking arguments, still driving legal battles, still holding within its grainy frames a possibility that history has not yet resolved. But that is exactly what happened. And as the courts move forward, as the technology continues to advance, and as the pressure to declassify and fully account for every piece of assassination-related evidence continues to grow, the Nix film stands as the most compelling reminder that the story of November 22, 1963, is not finished.